Well, tomorrow when somebody talks about the Federal Reserve at the water cooler or wherever they may be, and you're there and you hear it, you'll be able to set them straight after this program. We'll be back in a moment with Edward Griffin, the creature from Jekyll Island, on Coast to Coast AM. Ed, who are the members of the cartel? Are the bankers just from this country, or are they worldwide?
That's a tough one to answer. The cartel, technically the Federal Reserve System cartel, is American. The owners of the Federal Reserve System, so-called owners, I'll come back to that, are the member banks in the United States. They're not banks in Europe. However, who owns the banks in the United States? We don't know in many cases. Yes, you can buy stock in Chase Manhattan or Citicorp or something like that, but that doesn't tell you too much about controlling interests. Sometimes the actual controlling interests, some of the most large corporations, are hidden from view. The stockholders have street names, and they disappear into bank accounts, and you've got Swiss numbered accounts and all this sort of thing. We don't really know who the controlling interests are in some of the largest banks in America. Now, that doesn't mean we can't recognize some of the big players. I mean, obviously, the Rockefellers are right up there at the top. Earlier on, you asked me, do we still have evidence of family dynasties in the banking? Well, I mentioned the Rothschilds in Europe. I don't think I got around to mentioning the Rockefellers in the United States. That's so obvious that sometimes I even forget to mention it. But no, the Rockefellers are probably the preeminent banking family in the United States. It's an American institution, and but I'm sure that if we were able to peel back all the layers, we would find that there's an interlock with European financial interests as well. Now, where we're headed with that, though, is not going to be under the peeling. It's going to be right out on the surface, because the move today is to coalesce all of the central banks of the world into a new global banking system. They're talking about that openly now. They used to talk about it rather covertly 50 years ago or 60 years ago. They'd write papers on it or give seminars on it and say, I wonder if we could do this. And now they're holding meetings in Europe to work out the details of how to merge the central banks of all of the nations of the world into one. So it's right out in the open now, and I think the future, if this isn't turned around, is definitely going to be international.
Okay, now with the Fed, how does it work? How does the money system work? Do they just print it up? What do they do?
Okay, this is one of the great topics. A moment ago, we mentioned the fact that the Federal Reserve System is a cartel. But we must recognize that this cartel went into partnership with the federal government because they wanted to have their cartel agreement have the force and effect of law. See, one of the problems with cartels, and by the way, George, I'm going to get to the answer to your question, but I need this little platform
to
prepare for that. One of the problems with all cartels is how to keep the members of the cartel in line, how to make sure that they keep their agreement over a period of time. As you know, if there's an oil cartel, and let's say Mexico decides that they want to break the agreement, they've all agreed to fix the prices of oil, let's say, and Mexico says, no, I want to lower the price of oil. We got a lot of this stuff down here, and if we lower the price, we can get a bigger share of the market, and we'll make more money with a lower price. Well, the other members of the cartel really can't do much about that if Mexico wants to break its agreement. And you have the same thing with all cartels around the world. So how do you keep them in line? The answer is you go to the government involved, either a national government or an international one, and you get the government to take your cartel agreement and to pass it into law. Make the cartel agreement look like it's legislation, supposedly in the name of the people. Now every member of the cartel is bound by law to keep the agreement, and if they break the agreement, they go to prison. So this is why the cartel, called the Federal Reserve System, is in partnership with the federal government, is so that the cartel can have teeth. No, that's not its teeth. It's the teeth of the government. But nevertheless, it has teeth, and it can force you and me and all the competitive banks to abide by the cartel agreement. So now, the reason for going into all of that is that we have the de facto situation here that the cartel is in partnership with the federal government. Well, whenever there's a partnership, there's usually an advantage to both partners, or they wouldn't have gone into partnership. So the question then is, what's the advantage to the government for being in this partnership? And then what's the advantage to the banks themselves, the cartel members? And the answer to both questions can be found in an understanding of how money is created. So now we finally get to the question, how does it work? Let's start with the government side, the political scientists.
Okay.
Congress needs money. Boy, does Congress need money.
Always
now.
needs money.
Always needs a lot of money. And the reason, of course, this is so academic. I mean, it's so obvious. It's not academic at all. But obviously the politicians get elected if they promise benefits. So politicians are always promising benefits which cost money. But they get unelected if they raise taxes. So the great dilemma for all politicians is how to spend money without increasing taxes. And the answer, of course, is to borrow it. So that's no problem for the politicians. They'll just borrow the money, and so they'll issue a bond or a treasury certificate or note, depending on the maturity date, and they promise to pay it back in, let's say, a year or 5 years or whatever it is. So that way, politicians can spend more money than they take in taxes. The problem, of course, is that eventually the debt comes due, and the government has to pay back the loan plus interest. When that time comes, the politicians are still spending more money than they're taking in taxes, and so they don't have the money to pay back that loan. At least, and certainly not enough to pay back the loan plus the interest. Not to worry, we'll just borrow some more. This time they'll borrow more than the original amount in order to cover the loan and the interest, and business continues as usual. Well, eventually that round of debt comes due, and again, they still don't have enough money to pay for everything, so they borrow some more to cover that round of debt, and this goes on and on and on, and we have this phenomenon called the national debt, which is constantly rising. And it's constantly rising because the politicians will never have the backbone to tell the voters how much these benefits are really costing them. They'll never allow that to be passed to the voters in the form of taxes. And so they do it in the form of borrowing. Well, this can't go on, of course, forever. Eventually that bubble comes to an end, and we're seeing that process beginning to play out in the present time. But the politicians don't care. They never intend to pay back those loans. They figure it's a good ride. They'll have a good time and let the next generation worry about it. Yeah, right. So they don't really care. And the game is played very well, and the average voter doesn't get it, and he keeps voting for these people, and so forth. Now, that's just an introduction to the process. So let's imagine, though, that the government wants even more money than it can borrow, which is, in fact, the reality. In spite of the fact that there are plenty of people and institutions, banks, and other countries who are willing to lend money to the federal government of the United States in return for this promise to pay it back, which will never be done.
And this money that they want to lend to us, Ed, is it backed by anything?
Well, no, it was created by the Federal Reserve System in the same method I'm going to describe, but at least it's already there. It's already there.
Yeah.
It was created in the past, and so this money is loaned back to the federal government plus interest. But at that point, you see, the money supply does not increase because it's already there. But there's never enough. The government can never borrow enough in that fashion. There's always a shortfall, and now there's a huge shortfall. And so this is where the Federal Reserve finally comes into play.